Hello, hello, and welcome to another devincit or devincit, depends on how do you want to pronounce it, webinar. This time we are gonna talk about documentation, specifically what documentation is, as opposed to what most people think it is, why people don't write it, because it's very easy to see that when it comes to documentations, a lot of projects and companies are quite lacking. And if you're gonna write your own documentation, how do you even gonna do it? It won't be a full course. It's more like a set of guidelines and talking points, because this, just like any other topic in software development, this one is a little bit broad, so we decided to pick some specific parts of it and explain them more thoroughly, because we also think that some of those are not talked about as much as they should. Okay, let's start. Okay, so what software documentation is by definition? So according to Merriam-Webster, it's usually printed. That should be the interesting part of it, but usually printed instructions, comments, and informations for using a particular piece of system of computer software or hardware. Now, printed instructions is a little bit outdated part, I would say, considering that most of software documentation lives somewhere in the cloud or some files on someone's hard drive. But the part of the comments also should be a pretty interesting one, because printed instructions suggests one set of information, one form of putting those informations together. Meanwhile, comments are a pretty, let's say, separate set of data that can live inside printed instructions, but most of the time live outside of it. So according to this little definition, there is really no one version of documentation, because printed instructions and comments can be vastly different things. But let's go for the example. This is a README file from the Conva library. This is a pretty popular library for manipulating canvas in JavaScript. And this part, as you can see, this is a little information about how to draw rectangle on canvas using Conva. From the very beginning, from importing the script to the very end, which is calling mouse over and mouse out methods. So in this specific case, documentation is how I can use this piece of technology to do a specific thing. This is called quick look because it's like the first example from the top. So it's like an introduction to this library. It basically says, how can I use it for the most basic thing possible? So this is one example. But if you go for the Collins dictionary, we will see the written comments and graphical illustrations, flowcharts, manuals, etc. supplied with a program software system. Now, a manual has a very specific meaning. It contains explanations on how something works. And a lot of the time there are no comments in manuals, because manuals is something that you give to the end customer to explain to him how this particular piece of technology works. Meanwhile, comments are something that exists, let's say, around the manual. Those are not inside them. I mean, what was the last time you saw a comments inside, let's say, a manual for a fridge? But in the software world, comments are pretty common things. The same goes for illustrations and flowcharts. But when you also think about it, those are also different types of information, different forms of informations, because flowcharts can explain the same thing as comments, but in a vastly different way. This is also an example from Conva. This, as you can see, is the node hierarchy for the different components of that little system. Because Conva is built in a very specific way, where you don't just get canvas and draw rectangulars and such on it. You have stage, you have layers to that, etc., etc., which is something that has to be explained in order to properly use this library. And this specific part is also a little bit different because the first example was from the README, which exists in the repository in the GitHub. Sorry, and this one exists on the main page of the document of the whole library, because Canva has its let's say page with all the documentation necessary to run the application, but also it has a repository with the README file that also contains information on how to use that specific piece of technology. The only main difference is that in README you have like the most concise, the most simple part of this information. Meanwhile, on the page you have much more information. But that creates a problem right away, because you have two sources of the information about the same piece of software, and both of them are right, and both of them contains information that is important, but because those are separated, it also can create a little bit of confusion because of that. But if we go a step further, Collins defines documentation as something that provides proof of or evidence of something, or record of something. Now, that last part is pretty important in our case, because this is still Canva library. This is a comment from one of the tutorial sections where author explains how to do some specific things with the library, and someone got a little bit confused and asked about the details. And that little comment is also a part of the documentation, because based on the previous definitions, this little part explains how to do specific thing. Yes, it can basically be either copy and pasted to the README file or on the page itself. Sorry, I don't know what is happening here. On the page itself, or it can be print screened and also copied there. But now it exists on the third place, I would say, because Canva uses discuss system for comments, meaning that that this comment and all the rest exists on the separate page. So we have basically three places where the Canva information about Canva can be read. One is the GitHub page with the README file and the source files. The other one is the official Canva page, and the other one is comments, which can be visible on the Canva page, but exists in the different place. Which brings me to my main point when it comes to the first section of this little webinar. Traditionally, sorry, I really don't know why it's acting like this. Okay. So traditionally, documentation is something that is centralized. The documentation is something that, check. Oh, okay. No. Okay. So, yes, a documentation, a centralized collection of information, of documents, etc., etc. So a documentation in a traditional sense is just a stack of papers where you have all of the information necessary to understand how the application works, why it works the way it works, etc., etc. Basically, if you think about manuals, but for the developers. And that, in the current day and age, is a little bit of a outdated definition, because if you really get down to it, current documentation, what we think about what documentation is basically this. Because thanks to all the communication channels that are available nowadays, the fact that you can send people messages asynchronously using 2, 3, 4 different applications, send them emails, talk to them via Jira or via comments messages or pull requests, etc., etc. It makes it makes the documentation hard to be centralized, because with every single channel of communication, you can pass to your colleagues or to the end users a little bit of information about the project. And you will, because sometimes it's easier to just talk about your colleagues about the source of this or that feature, or the reasons why the pull request looks like this or not differently. And that message, that description will probably live on that Slack channel for the rest of the history, and not in the other place, meaning that other people won't have access to that information. But it's like when you have someone who created the system and he left like 5 years ago, and before he left, he also write down some information about the system, but that's it. So at that point, a piece of knowledge about the project, about the software, left the company with him. And because of that, that knowledge is not available anymore. And that might be a knowledge critical for the system, which means that he just left with the documentation, basically. So the current situation is that we used to think that documentation is like the centralized system. It's like this book that is updated with every changes, etc. But turns out that it's not actually the case, because we don't really keep information in one place. At least most companies that I know of don't do that, or at least they try, but there is a lot of problems with that because of the ways that we communicate currently, which is also one of the reasons why people don't write documentations, but that will be in a moment. So yeah, because the documentation is decentralized, because some piece of information lives on someone's hard drive in a form of the presentation, someone's have their information in the form of graph, there are comments in the code, there are comments in the pull requests. It's sometimes reading documentation means piecing together all of that separate information, talking to people, checking who has something, who knows anything about the system, and then making a cohesive whole all of that. Yeah. I don't know what is happening here. Okay, let's start it. Hope this one will work. Okay, so yeah, so why people don't write documentation? I mean, one of the reasons is because in decentralized environment, documentation can be basically everything. So writing documentation can mean gathering all of that information together, which is something that most people don't really want to do, because it's not really interesting in any way, shape, or form. I experienced situation when I would compile some information about a feature or a bug fix or something based on what I would find in the Slack messages and in emails, etc. But that work was a little bit tedious, a little bit boring, and in the end of the day, it was also not completed because there was always something missing, especially in the bigger companies where there are dozens of sources of information, dozens of people who has to say something about this or that specific feature. So we end up with a little bit of a mess of a sources. And what we end up with is like, how should I say it? The best that we can gather from all of them. But that's one reason. The other one is, yeah, it's hard to keep it all in one place and up to date, because again, this is all the sources of the documentation. Nowadays, we can try at least to write all of this information in one place. I met some teams that tried to do that. I met some analytical people who tried to do that. And the end result was that those people were basically compiling all of the informations from different sources in order to keep those information up to date and then pass that to developers, so the developers can make something based on the all the digging that the let's say managers or analytics people would do. So basically at that point, writing documentation meant compiling all the information from different channels, which is not something that most people would like to do. There is nothing really interesting about that. Also, there is no really one standard when it comes to documentation, because there are files that can be kept on someone's computer, doc files that are really not for documenting code, MD files that have different syntax from doc files. So also because doc files are like the standard standard type of files for the office environment, and that creates this weird situation when you have to use Office in order to write documentation, but the Office is not the proper tool for writing the code, and you sometimes want to put the code inside documentation. PDF files are not editable, so that's another kind of problem. And when it comes to MD files, I'm pretty sure that Office people will not be willing to learn another syntax, because why would they want to do that? Now, there are also attempts at putting documentation wiki sites, but that has another problems, because wiki sites might be better at storing both text and the code, but the problem is that those also has to be updated constantly, and there are things like conflicts in edits. There are things like problems with formatting, etc., etc., and also those sites are somewhere in the cloud, which can always go down at any point. Now, Confluence is like a wiki for the singular project, and that has its own problems, because sorry for a moment. Because again, it's not only in the cloud, it's also integrated with Jira. So if you don't use Jira, then Confluence is probably not for you. If you use Azure, there are other tools for that specific service. So and also you can also use the dedicated service for that, like ViewPress and Docusaurus or similar. But problem with that is that you have to make it, you have to build it, and then you have to put it somewhere on the internet for others to read it. So no matter which tool you use, there are some problems with them. Either you can't really put code there, or you can put code there, but formatting will be a little bit hard. Or maybe you have to update it constantly on the cloud, which has its own problem, etc. So there is really no one specific tool that is good for keeping documentation up to date, that doesn't come with a set of its own problems of the different size and type. Yeah, and another thing is that project documentation is not the same as code documentation. Okay, those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. Some people just say documentation all the time and that's it. Some people will specify that there is a code documentation or project documentation or software documentation. So there are also some problems with vocabulary, but the problem is that from the developer perspective, project is what that person is working on, is all the code base and things around it. Meanwhile, for the business people, project is the product, but also all the paperwork around it, all the advertisement, etc., etc. So it creates this situation where we talk about the same thing, but not really. It can lead to some problems in communication, and also because the project is about everything related to that project and also including code. Meanwhile, code documentation is about code. So those are similar in a way, but also very different, because they tackle different subjects. And because of which we'll also talk about a little later. Another thing, people don't really know how to write, because here's the thing: people know how to put together letters and words in order to construct sentences that have some specific meanings. But the problem is that most people don't know how to use those tools effectively. This is a short search from a few days ago. I was curious how many people would ask that question. As you can see, there is 558 millions of results, because one might say that there is just that many materials about on the subject, but I would say because people mostly don't know how to even write documentation. Maybe if they finished their degree in computer science, maybe there is some, but also that probably depends on the country and the educational system. But if you are self-taught, and I would argue that maybe half the people on the market today are self-taught, maybe even more. And if you want to find that information on your own, there will be problems. There will be problems because one, I'm pretty sure that most courses, most bootcamps, etc., won't really touch that on the topic, because it's more important to teach people how to write JavaScript than to, let's say, comment on JavaScript. And also because it's hard to dig really valuable informations about the topic. Most probably, if you want to learn how to write documentation, you have to either read a book or two, or just try it yourself and experiment along the way. So people don't write software documentation because they don't even know where to start. Not only what tools they should pick, but also what the structure should be, what the vocabulary would be, what they should emphasize and what they should ignore. Is the part of the software, this or that specific part, really that important to document it, or should we skip it? That's another thing. So also because code relates more to technical skills and documentation is more, I would say, artistic skills. What do I mean by that? When you write a code, you talk with the machine, and you give it a set of instructions in order to get some results. Yes, print me hello world in the console. When you write documentation, you write it for the people, and people are those little finicky things that may have problem understanding what do you mean. When you write a code, compiler or linter or any other tool will tell you, hey, there is an error here. The machine will not do anything about that, or the machine might not understand what do you mean. So there is some help with that. When you write documentation, and also because you write code for a very specific set of machines. Yeah, there is a lot of processors out there, a lot of graphic cards out there, a lot of hardware sets that you can work with, but when it comes to processors, there is a specific set of instructions that those will use, and when it comes to language, there is also a very specific set of instructions. An array has a limited number of options, a limited number of things that you can do to it. That's just how the language works. That's how it's just built. So in order to talk with the machine, you just need to know those pieces and put them together in something that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, you can just switch it around. That's easy. There is a limited number of options that you can use there, and that actually helps, because when you can do anything, that creates this problem. How should I say it? When you have a limited number of options, you know what you work with, and you can reason with that. You can pick the best options for the situation. When you have infinite amount of options, it's very hard to even start, which means that when you want to talk to people about your software, you also you probably at the very beginning don't know where to even start. Do you want to explain them the core concept? Do you want to explain them how specific parts work? And then people will ask questions. People will ask about additional explanations. Some will tell you that this sentence is too long, or that sentence is too short, or there is a part that you didn't even touch, which creates the situation where you have finished, let's say, product in the form of documentation, and then you have to update and make it a little bit better every time someone will ask you a question or will say that something is hard to understand for them, which is like writing a software, yes, but because but again, software has a limited number of instructions and limited number of options that you can use. Meanwhile, when it comes to people, that set of options is much bigger. And also because the software documentation has to be updated from time to time. Every time there is even a slight change, because that slight change might be important for someone. So it creates that situation where you push new changes to the master, and then you have to update some text files or some wiki page or something else, which should be a part of the pull request routine, should be a part of the development cycle, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes people don't even realize that they have to write some documentation. Sometimes people forget about that little part. Sometimes it's included in the estimations. Sometimes it's ignored completely. So because a lot of people treat documentation as an afterthought, like something that they can write if they really want, but they don't have to, then documentation is a lot of times ignored. In my case, there was a few cases when, while writing the code, I was thinking about also writing comments and maybe some explanations, mostly because that very specific feature that I was working on was also a little bit tricky or complicated or hard to understand, and I wanted to make it a little bit clear to people what it was doing. And also there was a situation or two where I decided to write some documentation because I was running out of time and I was not able to polish the code enough, which is a little bit against good practices and not really in the good taste, I would say. But the whole fact that I was thinking about writing words in order to explain code when the code in a lot of time should explain itself. But yeah, it was an afterthought, and I'm pretty sure that it is an afterthought for a lot of people, actually. And also, people don't really like to write it. And why? This I find on Quora while searching a few days ago. And I can relate because writing the code, as I said, this is not a technical, writing documentation, it's not a technical, it's more of a artistic skill. And it deals with words because code is also words. Let's not kid ourselves. But it's not really a programming. It has to do with paperwork, I would say, because it works on the same principle that making a Jira ticket or expanding on explanation or writing down a pull request description. This is the same area, basically, because it is about programming, but not directly. It's somewhere around the programming proper, which means that this activity specifically is not really that interesting. And because it's not about making code, about pushing features or fixing bugs, it feels like a waste of time. And in some cases it is, let's not kid ourselves, but yeah, a lot of the time it feels like a waste. And because it feels like a waste, because there are deadlines, and because I want to feel productive at work, I don't write documentation because it feels like I waste my time writing down information about how the software works. And that creates a situation where in a year or two, I would need some information about how the software works. And because nobody decided to write proper documentation, there is nothing that I can work with. So I have to read the code itself in order to learn. And I think to myself, well, maybe this time I will write some documentation, but not. So yeah. And also, I think this is one of the most important, if not the most important. People don't really read documentations. If you go to basically any group for the newbie programmers, you will find quite a lot of information, a lot of questions like, how do you do X with the Y? How do you, let's say, draw rectangle using canvas in JavaScript? And there is a lot of places that will explain that to people, including documentation for this or that specific library. But people seems to be more inclined to just ask question in order to get that information, or rather than read the documentation proper. It's like in that joke, it's better to spend 6 hours doing trial and error in order to get some results, rather than waste 6 minutes reading documentation in order to get the same results. And I don't really know where that came from. I don't really know what to do about that, but I know that this is a real problem because I see it every day. And when you think about it, it is probably the most discouraging, because compiling data in order to make a documentation about a feature isn't really that hard. It's a little bit tedious, it's a little bit boring, but it's possible because all the pieces are there. You just need to go around and grab them. But to write a documentation about your project, knowing full well that people probably won't read it, but they will go to the issues page on the GitHub and they will ask your questions there, it is discouraging. It makes the whole process a little bit pointless, I would say. Okay, but that was a lot of negativity there. But also the reason might be just because people don't read documentation and don't write it, etc., because they don't even know how, and they don't read documentations because, okay, people might not write documentation because they don't know how, and people might not read documentation because documentation might be not very good. Like, there are dozens and hundreds of libraries out there that can be brilliant, but people don't really know how to use them because documentation lacks a lot of information. I've been using at least a few of those. Some of them changed during the years so much that documentation is just outright wrong, to the point that not even also reading GitHub issues will not give me answers, meaning that all of the official channels are wrong, all the official sources are wrong, and that particular piece of software is just hard, if not impossible, to use by me. And because of that, at some point, I also thought, what's the point of reading documentation when it's always outdated or just plainly wrong? And here I would like to share some tips on how to make that documentation work, how to write documentation that will not only tell people how to use your software, but will also be easy to use. Because you can tell people how to use your software in, let's say, 10,000 words, but you can also probably do the same in 100 words, which will be much easier and simpler to use. So let's go with the basics. Now, when you read a, let's say, README file on GitHub, you will see that a lot of them has, apart from banners like this code has like 70% code coverage, etc., you will see 1 or 2 paragraphs about what this project is even about. It would be like, this little library is my answer to that other library and is about parsing text, but that other library was a little bit slow for my taste, so I decided to make my own, which is a little bit faster, except for this or that specific situation. And that's basically it. Yes, I can read that. When I search for specific libraries, I can read that little outline and be like, oh yeah, this is something that I was looking for. Let's see the rest. So at the very beginning, tell what are you even presenting to me? What is even this little piece of software? Because there are also people who will, for example, prepare their first projects, some learning materials from themselves, but they will not specify that, and they will share the repository with some other people and will like, please test it, tell me what you think about it. And those people will be like, I don't even know what this little particular piece of software does even. Could you expand on that? And because of that, it's also important to tell people how to run it and how to build it. When it comes to run, either which scripts should be used or how this particular library should be imported to the project. Because in the JavaScript world, JavaScript word is very specific when it comes to that, but there are, because we have a few ways that you can export your project or import it. So it is important to explain to people that some methods might not actually work, and because of that, the integration, they won't be even able to integrate that specific library to their project because they use this or that software. When it comes, because we have different bundlers, we have different tasks manager, we have different versions of Node, for example, and some options might be closed if you don't use specific type of software. So so if you can explain to people that yes, you can use either Parcel or Webpack or something else, and in order to do that, in order to use the specific library with this setup, you have to do this, that, or that, and that would be enough. And the same goes for building. And the build part is, I would say, more important for languages like C or C++ rather than JavaScript. But for JavaScript, it also can be really important. When you have, for example, a software that builds a static page and that static page can be served somewhere else, it's nice to know how I can even do that after integrating that specific library to my system. Again, how to use it for the case it was built for, because so basically, what are the most simple, most popular use cases? So if I have a library that works with strings, I want to know if it can parse strings, if it can cut strings, if it can, for example, cut one word into a few separate ones, and if it can change the first one to all uppercase, for example. And this is very easy, just some code snippets and some explanations, and that's it. Just like you saw with Canva. If you want to draw a rectangle, you just do this, and this, and that's it. Integrations. So how can I use this library with this other library? How can I use this library with this specific framework? How can I use this library in this specific environment? If I have Node 12, can I use it? Can I use it if I have Node 14 or 16? Will it work with Vue 2? If yes, if no, do I have to upgrade? If I can use it with Vue 2, what should I do in order to have that? That part can be a little bit tricky. Because, as I said, there is quite a lot of options out there, quite a lot of tools out there, and there is a good chance for people coming with a very weird setups from time to time. So this part should contains information about the most, let's say, basic cases, the most popular cases, and the rest can be filled later. Possible compatibilities, that is also important part, because I want to know if having version of Node 14, I can still use it, or do I have to upgrade to 16, or do I have to upgrade to 18? Will it work with Vue 2, or do I have to upgrade to 3? Or maybe the other way around, which version of Angular will it work with? Because there's libraries like, for example, Spectron, which is a testing library for the Electron applications. And that library has a little table with the information on which version of Spectrum will work, or rather should work, with different version of Electron. And without that table, considering that version of number version of Spectrum will be different from the numbered version of Electron, without that table, you will not be able to even use that library, because you would have to dig into the code and decide for yourself whether or not you can use it or not. And I also ignore the fact that this library in general seems to not work, but that's another thing entirely. And FAQ. Now this is something that you don't really have to put there, but it is very handy, because at some point people, if you have the project someone or GitHub, but also for the internal projects, let's not kill ourselves, from time to time people will come to you and ask questions like, how do I implement this specific library with this specific set of software? How can I use this library to do this and that? How can I, etc., etc. They will leave that questions in the issues section of the GitHub. They will ask you privately. They will send you emails, etc., etc. So again, you will have a different channels of communication and different pieces of knowledge spread throughout them. And FAQ is a great place to gather all of this. If you see that someone asked a question and then 10 other people ask the same question, it's a good idea to gather those and put those in the FAQ, because next time you can just say, oh, it's an FAQ, and be done with that. And because of that, also the compilation part of the writing documentation will go away, because you have that information actually compiled at this very moment in time. You just have to go to the documentation, to the FAQ section. That's it. So this is like the most basic things that if you want to explain how the feature work, how the library works, how the projects in general works, it should be enough, because it can be used in the very different environments, and most of the time it will work. Just keep in mind that this is about software, because I'm assuming that you will be writing documentation for the developers. Documentation for end users that are not developers will be a little bit different. But even then, you can mix and match. For example, you can have a library that you can use as a developer, but you can also use as a end user, because you can have, for example, a repository for a web. I wanted to say WebStorm plugin, but okay, let's go with that. Let's say you have a library documentation for a WebStorm plugin. So it is something that an end user can just download via software and be done with it. It can be something that the user can configure in some way. So it should be nice to have some information about that, but about it later. But also you can have information about how to modify it. And those two types of informations will be directed to different types of user. But those can also live inside one documentation, one repository, one README file, because people who needs information about how to, let's say, modify the plugin will find that information. The rest will just ignore it. So that's it. When it comes to more advanced things, yeah, customizations, because if you have an option to customize your software in any way, shape, or form, you have to provide that. Because especially when you have a more robust software with quite a lot of options, a list of functions with a list of props most of the time will suffice. Maybe a table with all of the props available for the software and explanations on how to use them, anything like that. Specific use cases, yeah, because again, in Canva, how to draw a rectangle, that's fine. But Canva as a library has actually a great documentation, because it includes information on how to draw different shapes, how to draw text, how to drag and drop, how to connect, how to use events, how to draw also very specific shapes, not only triangle, not only a star, but let's say a hex or something much weirder, let's say. So there is a long list of specific use cases with comments, with discussions, with details. So if you need to do some specific things, you just go to specific page and you will have all the information necessary, which is something that, yeah, at some point you will probably have to add, because putting that information in FAQ is not really something that you want to do. And putting that information on the basics section of the documentation will also not be good, because people who want to use your library for the first time will go there, and people who wants to use something more specific from your library to fulfill their needs will search a bit further. You start with basics, you go with advanced stuff. If you put advanced information in the basic section, you will have a really bad time. Things like roadmap or changelog are not necessary, but they are fine, because if you have software, even a little internal library that you will work on, it's nice to tell people what you're gonna do with it in the closer on distant future. Especially if there are people who really wants to use that specific library, but they can't because of some specific reasons. The same goes for changelog. Now, changelog doesn't need to be very robust, very specific. There are people who will write every little change, who will link to pull requests, etc., etc. And if you don't want to do that, you can just specify that the application will no longer crash because this, that, and that's it. Though you don't have to go into specifics. Just give people a general information what changed, especially when it comes to breaking changes. People needs to know whether or not they still can use your library after a big leap in the version number. And illustrations. Illustrations are fine. Those are very, very optional. But they also can help understand some things. Like, again, with Canva, you have a little graph of how different elements of the application works together, how different elements of application communicate with each other. If you remove that, people will have to dig for that because of the way that this application is structured, and that can be a little bit of a problem. So if you can explain, or if you can, for example, show how the software will look after you run it, if you can show people what will be the end result of using their specific feature or the software in general, it's nice to also give people that. Explanations for cut or dropped features. Now that is a very, I would say, specific part of the documentation and has its place when you change major version, because there are situations when you will drop features or you will mark them as deprecated, and it is nice for people who already has been using your software to tell them why, because sometimes those decisions might seem weird, might seem wrong, and only one or two only one sentence that will explain, yeah, I had to cut that because it was interfering with some other features. I will probably get it back in the future when I know how. Done. Everyone should be happy, at least for a little while. So yeah, so how to make your documentation a little better, how to make people read your documentation, how to make people want to also write documentation. So the first thing, yeah, it's nice to learn how to actually write, not how to put words together, but how to structure your text, how to ignore things that are not necessary, how to write only about the stuff that people actually care. I'm not even saying that you have to learn about creative writing, because that's a whole other set of skills, but just to practice a little bit, just to read a few articles about that, maybe a book, understand how to even write something that explains to people how to use your documentation. You can, for example, take existing manual, read it, and try to recreate it, and you will learn pretty quickly that learning a manual, like even the simplest manual, is actually pretty hard. Yeah, prepare a create structure. You can use a template for that, where it's like outline, use cases, FAQ, integration, etc., etc. And you go from the simple, basic stuff to the more advanced, more complicated, then some highlights here and there, and maybe FAQ at the end, and you are done. Highlight important parts, so underline them, use bold, things like that. Because if you want people to read long paragraphs explaining how stuff works, it's important to tell them where they should concentrate, and that will also help you, because it will basically tell you, maybe those 4 sentences around this one little part are not necessary, when you can just use this one or expand it a little bit in some way, and that would also suffice. Think about who will read your paper, because if you write software that will be used by non-technical people, for example, a plugin for WordPress, you don't really you have to explain them how actually use this little piece of software. But if you write that plugin for developers, so they can modify it, you have to use a little bit different language, because non-technical people will not understand you, and maybe vice versa, who knows. So think about end user, think about your target, and write for those people in mind. Keep it simple, because people might not really care for the history of the project. Yes, I want to use faster JSON parser. I don't care if that's like the 4th version of it, based on 6 years of your experience and some other library that you decided that is too slow. Just tell me that this is a library for parsing JSONs inspired by other library. Done. We can move on. And yeah, add an image or two if useful. I add a graph, add something that can help me understand how this specific piece of software can work. Some people will include GIFs in their documentation. Some will include videos linked, embedded from YouTube. So there is some. There is a saying that one picture can have a power of 1,000 words, of something like that. So if you really have that picture, then just use it, and that's basically it. So yeah, this was a short, pretty short, 50 minutes long introduction. I will say introduction, explanation on what documentation in the current software environment is, or more like I think it is nowadays, because it's the idea that documentation is like one big book about the software is still there, but I think that will evolve, because since people don't really know how to write documentation, I think they also not know that because they don't know where to keep it. And because we have nowadays a lot of tools for doing that, not always the best, I think at some point maybe there will be a new way of doing that, and spread documentation that is spread throughout the whole system through different places might be like a step toward that goal. Yeah, we also talked a little about why people don't write documentation, which can be also used to your advantage in order to in order to actually start. Because if you don't know why. If you know why people don't write documentation, you can also use it to actually write it, because you know what prevents people, what obstacles are there, and you can just remove them. And there's also a little bit about how to write documentation in order to what you can do in order to make your documentation a little bit better. So it was basically the same topic but from the other side. So basically do and don'ts when it comes to writing software. And yeah, we have still a few minutes, so if there are any questions, then feel free to ask them at this point. Okay, I don't see many questions, so let me end this webinar with a little information. If you think that this was in any way, shape, or form helpful to you, please consider, thumbs up, because that will help a little bit when it comes to YouTube algorithm. If you want to know about more streams and more webinars coming your way, there is a link to our channel on YouTube, and there is also a link to our official page where you can subscribe to our newsletter. We will inform you about another webinar and streams and all the other events like that. And also, if you think that all of that information was helpful in some way, please share that to other people, and I hope you also enjoy other materials that we have on our YouTube page. So yeah, I think that would be it. If you have more questions, please, we have still a few more minutes. You can leave them in the chat. I will try to respond to them. And other than that, thank you for your participation. Thank you for coming to our little webinar today, and I hope you will have a nice rest of the day. So again, thank you, and till next time.